Hi there, everyone. So, one of the interests that I have is crime. And in more recent years, I've been particularly taken with certain true crime stories. But I've had a lifelong interest in crime. I loved to read Enid Blyton mystery novels when I was a little girl, and I'm a diehard Agatha Christie fan. And I've taken an intense interest in certain true crime cases that I've researched. There are a couple that I've researched very heavily over a long period of time, and I love to get deep into a case that I find fascinating. And I think what I love the most about these really interesting cases is what it can reveal about human nature and human behavior. And as a student of human behavior and human nature, I am just absolutely fascinated and intrigued by the lengths to which people will go to conceal um, undesirable parts of their lives and of themselves. It's just fascinating to me, and I'm always fascinated to see how people behave under these incredibly stressful circumstances and the the stories that they can come up with and the different ways that we can analyze the evidence in order to arrive at the truth. It just really appeals to my analytical and logical brain. Um, and a case that I have been interested in for a couple of years, but have only really started researching heavily recently, is the Madeleine McCann case. I first um, heard about it obviously with the rest of the world back in 2007, but I didn't think too much of it. The news reached us in South Africa, but it wasn't, I suppose, as widely covered in the South African media as it would have been in the UK and elsewhere. And the first time I really heard about the facts of the case was 2 years ago when watching the Netflix documentary, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Now, I have since learned that that documentary is incredibly biased in favor of the McCanns. And I will say that because it was my first introduction to the case in any kind of real way, that it did predispose me to feel that they must be innocent at first. And I always find it particularly interesting when I start off a case with one particular opinion, and by the time I research more and more, my opinion changes and kind of becomes almost the complete opposite the more I research. And that is what shows me that my researching and analytical brain is working correctly. The fact that I'm willing to consider all possibilities to me is a good sign. And that's what I'm trying to do as I research the case of Madeleine McCann. Um, I've been heavily absorbed in reading different sources coming from different sides of the arguments, um, you know, concerning what happened to Madeleine. And I've been also examining the evidence and reading the Portuguese police files and trying to come to my own conclusions and just seeing what jumps out at me. So, in this series of videos, I just want to mention things that have particularly struck me. I'm not going to attempt to paint a complete picture of the case because I think that would be impossible to do unless I were to sit here for pretty much 12 hours straight, which obviously I don't have the energy for. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a series of videos pointing out what to me are interesting and suggestive facts um, that have particularly just struck me as a researcher, as an analyst, as a true crime kind of enthusiast, someone who has looked into cases before and someone who I just, obviously each person brings a unique perspective to a particular case and different things are going to strike different people. As I said, I'm not really going to attempt to provide a summary of all the facts because you can get that from the YouTube videos. I will just say I would encourage you, if you are trying to learn about this case, please do look at, a lot of different alternative sources. Don't just stick to the major true crime channels because in my experience, those are the channels that might have hundreds of thousands of subscribers and, big budget videos that look very slick and sound very good. But in my experience, they're often not all that well researched. That I've been shocked to see some of the major true crime channels talking about the case, and they get some major details wrong. And it's clear that the only research they've done is reading a few articles and watching a few YouTube videos, and they've kind of cobbled together a video just providing a summary of the case. And I just really don't think that does a case like this justice at all. If you really kind of want to get enough information to allow you to come to your own theory of what happened, I encourage you to look at all kinds of sources. Sources that are pro the McCanns, sources that are against the McCanns, sources that have come up with their own theories, sources that have looked deeply into the evidence, that have read the PJ files, that's the Portuguese police or the PJ, and even read the Portuguese police files yourself. They're available online. Portuguese law allows case files to be made available to the public once the case has been archived. And so all the evidence collected by the Portuguese police is actually available to look at online. But just very briefly, the McCanns, Kate and Jerry, and their children, Madeleine, Sean, and Amelie, were holidaying in Praia da Luz in Portugal with 3 other couples and their small children. So it was 8 adults in total and 9 children, and they were holidaying together as a group. And as I say, I'm not going to go into every single fact. I'm going to just be here to point out details and facts and bits of evidence that particularly stuck out to me. So this video might be more appropriate for someone who already has a kind of more or less a working knowledge of the case, of the basic facts. So the first thing that stuck out to me about this case probably says something about my own experience as a child of neglect, but it's how little time the adults in this group spent with their children. As far as I could tell from reading all the witness statements and looking at the facts, the parents within this group, the McCanns and their friends, really only spent meal times with their children. The rest of the time, the parents palmed their children off onto the resort creches who organized children's activities, or else they left them sleeping in their apartments alone while the parents went to go and have dinner at the nearby restaurant. And this is just extraordinary to me. They'd have breakfast together, then they'd drop the children off at the creche, they'd have lunch together, they'd drop the children off at the creche, they'd pick them up, they'd have brief dinner and playtime together, then they'd get them ready for bed, and then the children would be left in the apartments that the McCanns and their friends were staying in by themselves while the parents went to dinner. Leaving the children alone. And these were small children. They were all under the age of 4. So this is extraordinary to me. I mean, aside from the parental negligence aspect of it, I mean, small children of that age are not emotionally equipped to, soothe themselves if they wake up distressed, crying, wondering where their mummies and daddies are. I don't know how you can do that from that aspect. I mean, aside from something happening to them physically that you'd be too far away to help them. The restaurant where the parents were having dinner was 100 yards away from their apartments, and it was a good couple minutes walk to get there. But aside from that, I can't understand why you'd come on holiday with your children only to spend almost no time with them. If you wanted an adult's getaway, why not leave them at home with relatives or bring along grandparents to spend time with them? I don't understand why as parents you would just want to palm your children off onto, child care facilities for pretty much the entire day. It just doesn't, and then put them to bed early and leave them alone. just makes no sense to me. And these were mostly doctors that were part of the McCann's groups. Jerry and Kate McCann themselves obviously are doctors, and most of their friends were doctors as well. So these are people with busy careers who perhaps don't really spend that much time with their children as it is. I don't want to speculate about that, but to me it just seems incredibly strange. It reminds me of my own childhood, where my parents used to leave us alone a lot, me and my brother, um, either by ourselves or with a nanny, or we were just, they were always involved in their own pursuits, and that's just how these parents strike me. And that tells me a lot right off the bat about their mentality. I'm not saying that they didn't love their children, but it tells me something about the emotional investment and the emotional connection that they had with their children, or the lack thereof, I should say. Now, to their credit, David and Fiona Payne at least had brought Fiona's mother, their children's grandmother, with them, and they had a baby monitor in their apartment, so they could at least hear when their children cried. The rest of the couples didn't have that. The children kind of were completely alone, whilst the couples were having dinner. It's just unbelievable to me, really. Um, the next thing that jumped out at me, let me just take a sip of water. So I have a list here. So if you see me looking over, it's just me glancing over at my notes so that I cover all the points. I'm not going to cover everything in this one video. I'm going to try and break this up into a series of videos as I go along, and as I research the case more, I can kind of share my observations with you. The next thing that jumped out at me, that struck me, was the fact that the McCanns and their friends deleted all their phone activity from the day that Madeleine disappeared, so the 3rd of May 2007, and the following day, the 4th of May. Kate and Jerry and their friends deleted all the text messages and phone calls off their phones for those 2 days. Their phones have activity from on the Wednesday, so the day before Madeleine disappeared, and then from the 5th onwards, the 5th of May, so 2 days after Madeleine disappeared. But nothing for the 3rd and 4th of May. I think Kate just left 2 phone calls on her call log, but that was it. Everything else from everyone else's phones had been wiped clean. That is suspicious, is it not? It's suggestive anyway. I don't want to make too many inferences about that, except to say it's an odd thing to be doing if your main priority is looking for a missing 3-year-old girl. Why are you taking pains to delete messages and phone calls off your phones if it's all innocent? It's particularly strange to me that on the night that Madeleine disappeared, there are 4 phone calls. So the Portuguese police were able to see that things had been deleted off these phones because they could analyze, or they could get a record of where the phones pinged off the antenna, so the cell towers. And they could see that where the phones were pinging off the towers, there was no record on the phones themselves to show that an SMS or phone call had been received or made, but yet the cell phones were pinging off the towers. So they know that there was activity on the phones, but the activity had been deleted off the phones. And what's particularly interesting to me is that the cell phone towers show that there were 4 phone calls between Jerry and Kate on the night that Madeleine disappeared. After Kate raised the alarm, so I think it was between the time of like 11:15 and 11:30, there were 4 phone calls made between the two. Now you would expect that, especially if they're not together, you would expect parents of a missing child to be phoning each other, where are you looking? Where are you now? Have you seen her? Have you found anything? I would be making phone calls constantly, probably, if I was in that position. And yet they felt the need to delete those phone calls. Why? Kate McCann only left one phone call on her phone, but there were actually four. And Jerry McCann deleted all of them. So make of that what you will. It's impossible for us to know what the content of those phone calls and text messages were. The Tapas Nine, which is the McCanns and their friends, refused to hand over any information or answer questions about the text messages and phone calls. But it does seem clear that they were engaged in phoning family and friends, which is normal. You would expect that after your daughter's gone missing, you'd be wanting to phone home and talking to family and friends and letting them know what's happened. But it's also clear that they phoned the press. And my working theory at this point, based on what family and friends have said and their responses so soon after Madeleine's disappearance, my working theory at this point is that Kate and Jerry and their friends were trying to make sure that their family and friends back home got the stories straight. I think they were trying to make sure that everyone knew exactly what to say to the police and to the press if they were asked questions, and that there was consistency and solidarity amongst the group about the kind of official version of events. That's just my working theory, and I just think this is a good time to point out everything that I present in this video is obviously just my own perspective and opinion and theory. None of it is fact. I can't prove anything at this point, and there's still so much we don't know about the case. And there are so many gaps, even in the evidence itself, that I couldn't possibly say that I know for sure what happened. But the more I look into the case, the more I'm coming to my own kind of more or less working theory about what I think happened. As I say, I don't know all the details. That's not possible to know at this point based on the evidence we have, but I have a rough idea of what I think happened. But of course, everyone in this case is innocent until proven guilty, and no one has been proven guilty legally, so it's all alleged at this point. So the next fact that jumped out at me was on the day that she went missing, there was a play date organized for the children of the McCanns and their friends, where I gather that the children all played together, all kind of ate dinner together and then played together in the area around the tapas bar and the pool. There were kind of children's swings and jungle gyms and play apparatus, and the adults would kind of spend a little bit of time supervising the kids while they played together after they ate their dinner. And that was organized for the evening of Thursday, the 3rd of May, which is the same night that Madeleine went missing. All the children were supposed to get together and play in this area. And Madeleine wasn't present at this play date. Kate and Jerry decided not to take her. The reason that they gave was that Madeleine and her brother and sister were incredibly tired, and so they didn't take them to the play date. Now, on its own, that might not really tell us anything too much, but I just do think that it's important to note. I think it's something to file away in the back of one's mind. Anything out of the ordinary that happened on that day, I think we do have to take note of. And similarly, the families usually ate lunch together in David and Fiona Payne's apartment. They would usually gather together and make sandwiches, and everyone would eat together. And on that day, the Thursday, the 3rd of May, Kate and Jerry and their children didn't attend that lunch either. Now, to me, the fact that the children didn't go to the play date and that they didn't go to lunch as normal is suggestive that something was wrong that day. I think probably the kids were acting up a bit. They were maybe a bit, if if the facts of the case kind of suggest anything to me, it's, as I say, these kids were a bit neglected. And when small children are neglected, sometimes they do start acting needy and emotional and a little bit difficult because they want attention from their parents. And I haven't really heard anyone mentioning this, but my experience with children suggests that this is how they behave. I was a nanny for 6 months to fairly small children. I have a much younger brother whom I looked after and babysat a lot when he was little. And I've had, various interactions with small children via family, um, cousins and just friends, children, all of that sort of thing. And everything I know of children that age suggests to me that when they want their parents' attention, they do tend to start acting up, trying to get attention, trying to just keep their parents with them, trying to get their emotional needs met. And small children are kind of very self-centered in the sense that when they don't feel good, they want their parents' attention on them constantly. They want to be loved, they want to be reassured, and that's just very normal for a small child. And I wouldn't be surprised if Madeline and her brother and sister were perhaps just a little bit fractious and just needing and wanting attention that afternoon. And this conclusion becomes ever stronger if we think about the comments that Madeline was supposed to have made to her mum at breakfast that morning. She was supposed to have said to Kate, Mummy, why didn't you come when Sean and I were crying last night? So she alludes to the fact that she and her brother were crying the night before and that her mum wasn't there. So Madeline, if we are to believe that Madeline actually said this comment, which I think she probably did, or something like it, Kate and Jerry have taken that to be evidence that perhaps someone had tried to abduct her the night before. But to me, it's evidence of a child who has been neglected and who is kind of just really wanting attention and is noticing, they're aware enough to notice that their parents are not there when they're upset and crying and needing that reassurance and that love, which we can clearly see Kate and Jerry weren't. They spent very little time with their children on that holiday. And I think there must have been many times that Madeline wanted her mum and dad and they just weren't there. And so that's what that suggests to me. It's also worth noting that the upstairs neighbor, Pamela Fenn, the night before that. So we have Madeline commenting on the fact that she and her brother were crying the night before, and her mum didn't come and comfort her when they were crying. And the previous night, so that would have been the Wednesday, the 2nd of May, that night that Madeline was referring to, and the night before that, so Tuesday, the 1st of May, the upstairs neighbor, Pamela Fenn, had said she'd heard a little girl or a child around Madeline's age. She thought it was a child of around Madeline's age crying for over an hour, about an hour and a quarter, she said, just crying hysterically, constantly, with nobody to comfort her or calm her. And that the parents, Kate and Jerry, only came home at 11:45 that night. And that kind of flies in the face of Kate and Jerry's claim that they were checking on their children every 20 minutes to half an hour or so. So that there we have evidence of Madeline crying 2 nights in a row before she was reported missing. And I think that's suggestive. To me, it suggests that Madeline's behavior is escalating and that she's becoming more upset and she's trying more and more to get her emotional needs met through crying, through asking her parents why they're not coming when she's crying. And to me, that's just very heartbreaking. But it suggests to me also that Kate and Jerry not only ignored the signs that Madeleine was needing them emotionally, but also might have thought that they needed to do something in order to keep Madeleine quiet whilst they were out having dinner with their friends. Um, whether that's medicating her, which I think that they probably did, or whatever the case might have been, I think that they must have realized that they couldn't continue to let her kind of cry become more and more out of control as she was crying, and they weren't there, and they obviously weren't willing to stay home from having fun with their friends. So as I say, that to me lends credibility to the idea that she was, might have been sedated on the night that she went missing. It's worth noting that Pamela Fenn, the upstairs neighbor, didn't report hearing anything from the McCann's apartment on the night that Madeleine went missing. She, didn't report any crying. So that tells me either somehow miraculously Madeleine had figured out how to sleep through the night and she was okay, or that she wasn't there, or that the McCanns had given her something to make her sleep deeply. And whilst we're on the note of, the McCann's dinner arrangements, something I haven't heard people mention too much is how much the McCanns and their friends were actually drinking at these dinners that they were having at the Tapas bar. I read in one of the witness statements that Jerry and Kate and their friends were averaging about a bottle of wine a night each. Not just a bottle between the table or a bottle between a couple. They were having around about one bottle each. And that's what they're willing to admit to. It could have been more than that. I mean, I think we know people usually in that sort of situation would be more inclined to kind of understate how much alcohol they were drinking. But let's just take them at their word and say they were drinking about a bottle of wine each per night at dinner. That's not including the drinks that they were having in their apartment before coming to the Tapas bar. We know that Kate and Jerry had a beer and wine in the apartment before even coming to the restaurant. So these were parents who were getting, if not drunk, at least pretty tipsy every single night. And they want us to believe that in this inebriated state, they were making these regular 20 to 30-minute checks on their children, which was a couple minutes walk from the restaurant, and that they were being responsible parents and really checking that their kids were okay. I think in a lot of cases, these checks, when they happened, were more or less just listening at the door to see if they could hear any crying. That's kind of what it sounds like from the witness statements as well. Another misconception that's out there is I think a lot of crime channel or true crime channels and people who've reported on the case have said that the McCanns and their children, the McCanns and their friends were checking all the children with each check, but that's not actually true. If you read the witness statements, each set of parents was only checking on their own children, not on all the children. And it was rare, it happened occasionally apparently, that if a parent was going to check on their own children, they might listen in at someone else's door just to hear. Their apartments were all very close together, so sometimes they just listen in at someone else's door just to see if the kids were okay. But in general, they were only checking on their own children. And on the night that Madeleine was reported missing, we actually find the witness statements saying that there were more checks going on than usual, and that people were kind of checking a little bit more on each other's kids than usual. So make of that what you will. To me, it kind of suggests an attempt to make the whole system of checking on their children sound a little bit more reliable and good than it actually was. We know, for example, that Matthew Oldfield, when he went to go and check on Kate and Jerry's children, at I think it was around about 9:05, I think it was. He only looked in the door and could only see the twins. He didn't even see Madeleine when he checked on Kate and Jerry's kids. So there really wasn't this robust system of checking that they would like us to believe. And we have some sources at the Tapas restaurant saying that the parents actually only very rarely left the table to check on the kids. Then we have other sources saying that the checks did happen every half hour. It's difficult to tell, but I don't think that all the children were checked on every half hour. It was more like a parent was getting up every half hour to go and check, but not checking on all the children. They were only checking on their own children. So anyway, the next thing I just want to mention is that something which has been made a big deal about by the McCanns and their representatives and by the mainstream media at the time is that the Portuguese police didn't do a thorough enough job of closing off the crime scene and putting in roadblocks to, check cars and vehicles that were leaving the area to see if there was to see if Madeleine could have been taken, via those routes. That they didn't close off the area quickly enough. And there's been a lot of unjustified criticism leveled at the Portuguese police. If you look into it more carefully, you'll see that the Portuguese police did absolutely everything that they could with the resources that they had and actually put in a mammoth effort to try and find Madeleine. But it seems very clear as well that according to them, and not having the bias that the British police seemed to have and the British media had, the Portuguese police seemed to have come to the conclusion fairly early on that the parents of Madeleine, Kate and Jerry, might have been involved in her disappearance. And this offers a good explanation, really, of why they might have taken a while to close down the area. They found the McCann's behavior to be suspicious right from the beginning. And especially when you consider that they were made arguidos or, persons of interest not long after. And when you look at the line of questioning, when you look at the investigations that were done by the Portuguese police, it's pretty clear that they were working on the hypothesis that Kate and Jerry might have been involved. I think it's worth noting at this point that in the vast majority of cases where a child goes missing, it is somebody very close to the child who is responsible. And that's not to say, obviously, that we should take that as damning evidence of Kate and Jerry. There are plenty of other, facts and pieces of evidence which do suggest that Kate and Jerry could have been involved. But the Portuguese police were working on a pretty strong working hypothesis that Kate and Jerry were involved. And so they would have preferred probably to devote their resources to investigating Kate and Jerry and investigating their friends and Kate and Jerry's connections and what role they might have had in their daughter's disappearance than closing off an area which, would have taken a lot of resources, which would have been perfectly fine and justified if they truly believed that Madeleine was kidnapped. I don't think they did believe that. There's an interesting moment in a video put out by Sonia Poulton, who's a brilliant journalist, and I highly recommend you check out her channel. But she goes into the police station in Praia de Luz and asks for statistics about how many foreign national children have gone missing from Praia de Luz over the years. And the police officer says, I can give you one statistic. There've been none before or since Madeleine McCann. She's the only one. So Praia de Luz is not generally considered to be an area that's unsafe. and foreign national children don't generally go missing from that area. So I think it's probably safe to assume that the Portuguese police just didn't believe she'd been abducted. They believed Kate and Jerry were responsible for her disappearance, and that's the way that their investigation went. So it wasn't so much negligence on the part of the Portuguese police, it was they were pursuing a particular line of investigation, really. The next thing that I think is really interesting to point out, simply because of how events have played out, is there's a fantastic podcast called Maddie that was produced by 9news.com.au, which is an Australian news broadcaster. And it was created and produced by a journalist called Mark Sonokonoko, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it's a brilliant podcast that explores the Madeleine McCann case, and I highly recommend that you check it out. It explores alternative theories and not just the abduction theory. And it really does a great job of asking some of the difficult questions that a lot of mainstream media outlets just aren't willing to ask. But in that podcast, Mark Sonokonoko, the journalist whose podcast it is, interviews Gonzalo Amaral, who was the lead investigator on the Portuguese investigation of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And Gonzalo Amaral, as is widely known, suspected the McCann parents, Kate and Jerry, of being responsible for the disappearance of their daughter. And it's something he still suspects to this day. It's what he still believes. He's written a book called The Truth of the Lie, and was embroiled in a lawsuit with Kate and Jerry, which he ultimately won. But the podcast interviews him, and he makes a claim in the podcast. And what I think is interesting about this is the podcast was made in 2017. So a few years before this actually happened. But Gonzalo Amaral claims that the British police would eventually try to pin the crime of what happened to Madeleine on a German paedophile who is currently serving time in jail. Now, how he could have known that back then, I don't know, but he must have had sources still, close to the police, or perhaps people who were sympathetic to him that were still involved in the investigation who tipped him off about this. But that is exactly what we see did happen. The British and German police did eventually find a suspect. We know now his name is Christian Burkner, whom they have tried to pin the abduction of and murder of Madeleine McCann onto. There's no evidence as yet to link him to Madeleine McCann's disappearance, or none that's been made available to the public just yet. But I do think that it's fascinating that Gonzalo Amaral, even at that stage, even back in 2017, predicted that that the British police would go in that direction and try and find a German paedophile to pin the crime on. Because I think what we know, those of us who really looked into the case, we can see that the British police is absolutely unwilling to investigate the McCanns any further. Their absolute refusal to accept the possibility that the McCanns could have been involved in the disappearance of Madeleine means that they would have eventually had to have found a suspect. This case has cost the British taxpayer millions and millions of pounds, and the Madeleine McCann Fund, has had millions of pounds donated to it. No suspect has ever turned up, and so they really eventually would have been under pressure to come up with someone, and so they found Christian Burkner that they're going to try and pin the case on and perhaps eventually close the investigation. But I don't think those of us who really know the case or are really investigating the case will be satisfied with that. And I don't think that they're going to be able to come up with compelling evidence to show that he is actually the one that's responsible. Um, the last piece of information that I just wanted to highlight, because I just think it's absolutely fascinating, again, considering the timing of it and how kind of how psychic in nature it turned out to be, how predictive it turned out to be, is the Madeleine McCann Fund, which is a not-for-profit limited company that was set up by the McCanns, ostensibly to collect money to help in, their private investigation to try and find Madeleine. I mean, there are many interesting things about this fund, but to me, what is interesting, or what jumped out to me, is that this fund was set up mere days or weeks. I think it was possibly 2 weeks after Madeleine disappeared. Supposedly because the public kept approaching the McCanns and wanting to donate money and wanting to help. And I can believe that. I think most of the public are composed of decent people who would want to help and who would feel very distressed by the story that they kept reading about in the news. But there's an interview on TV of Kate McCann's father. I believe his name is Brian. He's on TV speaking to a journalist mere days or weeks after Madeleine has disappeared, talking about the Madeleine McCann Fund and how people can donate to this fund. And he seems very eager to get the word out there of how people can donate to the fund. And even at that point, that early on, Madeleine hasn't even been gone for 2 weeks. And Kate McCann's father already at that stage says that the fund is most probably going to be mostly used for legal fees. Legal fees. Now, how would he know at that point in time that Madeleine's parents, Kate and Jerry, would need so much money for their legal fees? I believe that Kate and Jerry's immediate family probably know that they are responsible for Madeleine's disappearance. And they predicted that there would be a backlash against Kate and Jerry at some point, either by the legal system or by the public. And Kate and Jerry would need to defend themselves. And that is exactly what we've seen. Kate and Jerry McCann are extremely litigious when it comes to anyone who makes any accusations of them. They've been successful in banning books that have sought to explore what happened to Madeleine McCann. They launched a very high-profile and expensive libel suit against Gonzalo Amaral, which, as I say, eventually Gonzalo Amaral did actually win. But Kate and Jerry McCann have spared no expenses when it comes to legal fees to defend their reputation. And it was as if even back then, so shortly after his grandchild had disappeared, that Kate's father knew that they would need this enormous amount of money to wage their legal battles in order to protect their reputations. And why? As the parents of a missing child, a child who's been abducted, why would you need to make provision for your, legal defense? I just think it's incredibly ominous that he made that comment. And I'll leave it to you to interpret what that means. So that's where I'm going to leave it for today, but I will be back with other videos about this case, sharing interesting facts that I come across and theories as I develop them. And I highly encourage you to look into this case yourself. Let me know what your thoughts and theories are, and let's share and pool our information together and hopefully try and shed a little bit more light on this case and reach a little bit more clarity. That's all that I want to do. So I'll see you next time, guys.